What if the Bible's most vivid enemies, men who landed from across the sea, who built ports and fortresses, who fought with iron swords and chariots, and who are named in prophetic oracles for total destruction, actually did vanish from history as a distinct people? What if the map kept their name, while the people themselves dissolved into the fog of time? The Philistine Enigma asks both questions at once. Where are they now? And what did they believe? Answering them requires us to move between Scripture, the open ground of excavation, and the careful lab benches of geneticists. The story that emerges is neither simple triumph nor total mystery. It is the tale of sea-born warriors who arrived in the late Bronze Age, established a sophisticated coastal confederacy, contested Israel for generations, and over centuries were absorbed into successive empires, leaving pottery, temples, inscriptions, and, faintly, fragments of their DNA. Here is the thesis in one line. The Philistines appear in the archaeological record as newcomers with strong Aegean ties, sea peoples who settled the southwestern Levant around 1200 BC, built a durable five-city polity, dominated the coastal plain through maritime skill and military technology, practiced a religion that blended Aegean and Canaanite elements, Dagon among them, and were eventually subjugated, displaced, and assimilated so thoroughly that they ceased to exist as a distinct ethnic group. Their disappearance, intriguingly, meshes with several prophetic pronouncements in the Hebrew prophets and with evidence from archaeology and emerging ADNA studies. Over the next hour, we'll trace their arrival, unpack their culture, sketch how they fought and ruled, and follow the slow arc of decline, leaving the final turns of their story to the archaeological and genetic detective work that completes the biblical picture. If this subject fascinates you, and you want more deep dives into biblical history and archaeology, take a moment now to subscribe. There's much more ahead. To understand the Philistine beginning, we must situate them in the upheaval of the late Bronze Age. Around the end of the second millennium BC, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a cascade of collapses and migrations. Royal palaces burned, trade networks retracted, and refugees moved in multiple directions. In Egyptian records, especially the inscriptions at Medinet Habu honoring Ramesses III, there is a vivid image of a broad sea-borne movement of peoples who fought along the Levantine shore and clashed with the Egyptian state. Among the groups named in Egyptian lists is a people rendered in the hieroglyphs as Peliset or Peliset. For many scholars, that ethnonym is the best external reference to the biblical Philistines. The term sea peoples functions as a convenient label, but it masks diversity. These were not a single tribe or unitary nation. Rather, they were a coalition of maritime groups dislocated by the disruption of the Bronze Age world. Some came from the Aegean and Anatolia, others from the central Mediterranean. What distinguishes the Philistine strand in this mosaic is how they settled and organized themselves once they arrived on the southern Levantine littoral. Archaeology shows a striking pattern from roughly the 12th century BC, the emergence of new material culture, distinctive pottery forms with Aegean affinities, house plans that echo Mediterranean layouts, and a set of dietary and burial practices not typical of inland Canaanite sites. Coastal towns along a narrow tract of fertile plain consolidated into a recognizable region, Philistia, with a network of 5 principal cities that dominate the historical memory: Gaza, Ashkelon, also spelled Ashkolon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Those 5 cities were not mere neighbors. They appear to have constituted a confederation in which each city had its own local lord, known in the biblical text as a Cyrene, a title roughly rendered lord or chieftain in the English translations. The evidence suggests a political equilibrium in which each urban center preserved autonomy while participating in shared economic and military networks. This arrangement made sense for a people who derived strength from the sea. control of ports, shipbuilding, skilled crews, and coastal trade all required coordination without necessarily producing a centralized monarchy. The Philistine polity was urban and maritime, organized around fortified settlements that controlled hinterlands and trade hubs rather than a single iconic capital. Archaeological signatures give texture to this picture. Pottery is one of the clearest markers. Beginning in the early Iron Age, sites in the coastal plain begin to produce ceramics with decorative schemes and vessel types that echo Mycenaean and other Aegean styles, what archaeologists often categorize as Philistine bichrome ware and related wares. The shapes, painted motifs, and manufacturing techniques are recognizably different from the Canaanite ceramics of the preceding centuries. Houses in newly founded Philistine towns often display multi-room plans with courtyards and built features that would feel familiar to an Aegean observer. Metalworking debris and specialized craft areas attest to active industries. But the Philistines did not remain static. The earliest Aegean features are gradually overlain by local practices as they adapt to Levantine economies and contacts. Dietary remains provide another striking pointer to identity. Faunal analysis, what archaeologists can learn from animal bones, shows elevated consumption of pork at Philistine sites, especially in earlier phases. In the inland hill country and among many Israelite sites, pork is comparatively rare, making this a useful contrast marker. That dietary pattern aligns with what we might expect from Mediterranean settlers, who brought livestock preferences and husbandry techniques from island and coastal economies. Over time, of course, dietary practices blurred with those of neighbors, but for a few centuries, the archaeological record preserves a cultural fingerprint. Religious practice is harder to reconstruct with certainty, but the lines are visible. The Philistines worshipped deities whose names surface in biblical polemic and in isolatable archaeological contexts. The most famous of these is Dagon, attested in texts and linked in the Hebrew Bible to the Philistines when the Ark of the Covenant was captured and placed in the Temple of Dagon in Ashdod, see 1 Samuel 5. Dagon seems to occupy a central role in the Philistine religious landscape, yet that cult likely interwove Aegean motifs and Canaanite or Levantine deities, such as forms of Baal. Temple architecture unearthed in some sites shows a mixture of building plans, cultic furniture, and votive assemblages that argue for a syncretic practice rather than a rigid, isolated theology. Temples were places of communal feasting, rites tied to maritime prosperity and martial success, and public displays of piety that reinforced urban leadership. Names and language offer a final piece of early identity. While no fully formed Philistine language corpus survives, a scattering of personal names, loanwords, and onomastic patterns suggest that the newcomers initially carried a non-Semitic, likely Aegean, linguistic substrate. Over generations, however, inscriptions and administrative texts from the region point to the adoption of Northwest Semitic languages, eventually a dialect close enough to Phoenician and Hebrew that Philistine elites could appear linguistically local. This rapid linguistic shift mirrors the genetic and cultural blending the stones themselves seem to indicate. Newcomers arrive, maintain distinctive practices for a while, then weave themselves into the fabric of the region. If the Philistines' material culture announced their arrival, their political economy explains their early success. The coastal plain is narrow but highly productive, and control of ports offered strategic advantages. With ships and seasoned sailors, the Philistines could move goods and troops, project power along the coast, and establish supply lines that inland polities lacked. Their location also put them at the crossroads of trade routes between Egypt, the Levant, and the Mediterranean islands. So they became intermediaries in a revived coastal commerce after the chaos of the late Bronze Age. Archaeological finds Coastal warehouses, harbor installations, weights and measures speak to an economy that married maritime trade with localized craft specialization. Craftsmen and metallurgists are central to the picture. In a world entering the Iron Age, the ability to produce superior weaponry and tools was a decisive advantage. The biblical text, in a passage that reflects later memory as much as immediate reality, records a striking observation in 1 Samuel 13:19-22. Now there was no blacksmith to be found in the land of Israel, but in Philistia there were blacksmiths. Indeed, the narrator's point is not merely tactical, it is sociological. Control of ironworking undermines an opponent's capacity to arm itself. Archaeological layers at several coastal sites show abundant slag, furnaces, and ironworking debris. Together, these elements suggest that the Philistines were early adopters and perhaps regional innovators in iron technology. Whether they maintained an exclusive monopoly is debatable, but their technological edge likely shifted power balances in local conflicts, making their presence a perennial security concern for neighboring highland polities. We begin to see why biblical narratives repeatedly cast the Philistines as Israel's principal antagonists for a substantial stretch. Judges frames an era in which the Israelite highlands and tribal confederacy struggle against Philistine pressure. The stories of Samson, a charismatic and violent figure who alternately befriends and defies Philistine society, Judges 13-16, are set against this background of city-state power and cultural friction. Samson's feats, locking horns with Philistine chiefs, toppling temple columns, are as much literary illustrations of conflict as they are recollections of a people who dominated certain technologies and military tactics. But the Philistine presence is not simply military. Urban life in their cities contained courts and palaces, marketplaces and artisan quarters, family homes and public cult spaces. Inscriptions recovered at Ekron, the famous Ekron inscription found in the 1990s, anchor the Philistine urban hierarchy to named rulers and royal houses in a way that helps us transition from the broad strokes of archaeology to the specifics of political rule. Epigraphic evidence confirms that Philistine elites participated in regional power networks and in the economic flows that connected inland and coastal worlds. This combination, maritime skill, technological advantage, urban organization and syncretic religion, created a resilient society. For a time, the Philistines could challenge their neighbors, exact tribute, and maintain a cultural distinctiveness that the archaeological record recognizes. Their cities were fortresses, both of stone and culture. Yet even in their height, signs of fusion already appear. Ceramic styles began to hybridize, local motifs blended with Aegean patterns. Economic ties with Canaanite neighbors deepened. It seems that by the early Iron Age, the Philistines were not an isolated colony, but a dynamic participant in Levantine life, someone at once foreign and familiar. That ambiguity would shape how history remembered them. As outsiders, yes, but also as neighbors who left a permanent mark on the coastal plain. And still, if we stand at the edge of these excavations, brush the dust off the pottery, and consider the names carved in stone, we confront the larger puzzle the prophets addressed. Hebrew prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zephaniah pronounced fierce oracles against the Philistines. Jeremiah's book contains an oracle in chapter 47, directed against the Philistines. Ezekiel, chapters 25 and 26 among others, voices judgments that include the fall of Tyre and the desolation of Philistine strongholds. Zephaniah 2:4-7 names the 5 city-states and predicts their humiliation. Prophecy in the prophetic imagination is theological and rhetorical, but it also participates in the political reality of the Near East. The prophetic thunder against Philistia must be read alongside the military and imperial developments of the first millennium BC, Assyrian expansion, Babylonian campaigns, and later Persian and Hellenistic reconfigurations. To move from these cultural and textual sketches to the question of disappearance, we need to follow the Philistines forward into the era of imperial domination. The Assyrian juggernaut of the 8th and 7th centuries BC altered the map. Assyrian campaigns often involved punitive expeditions, sieges and deportations, policies that could uproot local elites and reorder populations. We can trace how Philistine autonomy erodes under external pressure. Some cities become vassals, paying tribute and hosting imperial officials. Others suffer direct assault. In the turmoil of great empires, smaller polities like the Philistine Confederation found their capacities to self-govern diminished. As we approach the climactic centuries of the first millennium BC, Judah and Israel, the Philistines, and the imperial powers, the Assyrians and later Babylonians, interact in complex ways: alliance, resistance, submission, and occasional resurgence. The biblical narratives from 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel preserve snapshots of this contested geography, scenes in which individual heroes and kings negotiate the tightrope of survival. The episode of the Ark in Ashdod, in 1 Samuel 5, illustrates how religious conflict and civic pride intersected. The Davidic narratives that include the encounter with Goliath, in 1 Samuel 17, and subsequent Philistine campaigns testify to the continuing military stakes. Yet the political collapse that would follow was not simply the result of Israelite triumphs. External empires, most notably Babylon, would play a decisive role. Babylonian campaigns at the start of the 6th century BC devastated many Levantine coastal cities. Some centers were razed and populations deported or dispersed. Prophetic declarations about Philistia's desolation, while couched in theological language, did not float in a vacuum. They correspond in many cases to the geopolitical pressures and violent dislocations that the archaeology records. Before we go further into campaigns and the final dismantling of Philistine political life, it is necessary to slow down and examine one of the most modern threads in the story, the science of ancient DNA. In recent years, tiny fragments of bone and tooth recovered at coastal cemeteries, including a notable Ashkelon cemetery excavation first publicized in 2016, have enabled scientists to test biological ancestry in ways that were impossible a generation ago. The headline finding from these studies is intriguingly consistent with the broader narrative. Early Iron Age individuals from Philistine contexts show a genetic signal that aligns with Aegean-related ancestry, which then becomes diluted over subsequent generations as local admixture increases. Put simply, the genetic evidence suggests that a group bearing some ancestry traceable to the broader Mediterranean did arrive and blend rapidly with the local population, confirming in biological terms what pottery, houseplants, and dietary remains had long hinted at. But here, caution is vital. Ancient DNA samples remain limited in number and time depth. They tell us about individuals and localities, not entire peoples at every moment. The pattern of initial genetic distinctiveness, followed by rapid admixture, offers a compelling model for cultural assimilation, but it does not transform every aspect of historical complexity into a neat proof. Population movement is messy, and identity is a social category as much as a biological one. Still, the convergence of textual prophecy, material culture change, and genetic signatures strengthens the argument that the Philistines were newcomers of Mediterranean origin who became Levantine over centuries. As we move from these scientific revelations back to the human scale, a soldier sharpening an iron blade, a priest in a Dagon temple, a potter painting bichrome motifs, we should keep a balanced posture. The prophet's words swell with theological meaning and moral urgency. Archaeology fills in the quotidian texture. Genetics adds a new axis of evidence about origins and admixture. The Philistines emerge not as a single monolithic entity, but as a plural phenomenon. Seafarers, city builders, craftsmen, warriors, worshippers, who over several centuries both shaped and were reshaped by the world they occupied. At the same time, the prophetic voice remains audible. Where some oracles forecast complete annihilation, the archaeological record asks us to refine that notion. Total physical extermination of every individual is rarely the historical pattern. More commonly, empires destroy institutions, displace elites, and precipitate assimilation. The prophetic imagery of ruin, cities made desolate, altars broken, peoples scattered, can map onto the very real processes of conquest, deportation, and cultural absorption that leave a people no longer distinct. Philistia's urban infrastructure could be dismantled, religious centers razed, and political autonomy eliminated, while genetic and cultural integration completed the process of disappearance. Having sketched origins, early society, religious life, and the first glimpses of political confrontation, we are poised on a critical edge. How did the Philistines' military advantages play out in sustained conflict with Israel and later imperial powers? Which battles and sieges marked turning points? How did Assyrian and Babylonian policies of deportation and integration accelerate the dissolution of a distinct Philistine identity? And what do the full assemblage of inscriptions, excavation reports, and genetic datasets say when read together across centuries? These are the questions that will carry us forward, into the thunder of clashes preserved in the biblical narratives, into the ruin layers where we see imperial scorches, and into the laboratories where fragments of bone whisper of mingled ancestries. The next phase of the story traces the arc from Philistine dominance to subjugation, examining the interplay of technology, warfare, empire, and faith that ultimately answers the two central questions of our title. The ground is ready, the sources are many, the convergence of disciplines is underway, and the conclusion will demand both historical rigor and theological sensitivity. The contests that defined Philistine-Israelite relations were not static skirmishes, but high-stakes confrontations where technology, terrain, and theology intersected. Imagine the coastal plain as a thin green ribbon between sea and hills, a corridor of farms, ports, and fortified towns. From that ribbon, the Philistine cities could field sailors and charioteers, mobilize iron-forged troops, and draw on maritime logistics that made sustained pressure on the inland highlands possible. Their military profile included well-armed infantry, skilled seamen, and formidable champions who captured the popular imagination, Goliath being the most enduring. When the biblical text describes a champion standing before the Israelite lines and challenging their armies, it is not merely a theatrical device. It recalls a social reality in which individual warriors could embody a city's honor and a polity's military prowess. 1 Samuel 17. But technology often decides outcomes more than single heroics. The iron advantage, associated with Philistine workshops, had strategic consequences. If, as the archaeological record suggests, early Iron Age coastal centers maintained active ironworking production, slag heaps, furnace remains, and specialized smithing zones, then the availability of weapons and tools would alter the balance of power between lowland urban societies and the hill-farming tribal confederacies to their east. This technological gap helps explain passages like 1 Samuel 13:19-22, which note a scarcity of blacksmiths in Israel while Philistia maintained them. It's not merely a literary jab, it is congruent with a world in which metallurgy could tip local hegemony. Take the stories of Saul and Jonathan as another case study. The Philistines' control of the coastal access points made it hard for Israelite kings to project power seaward or to secure steady supplies of iron. Jonathan's daring raid at Michmash, 1 Samuel 14, reads as the work of a brave prince, but it is also the flashpoint of asymmetric conflict, an inland polity striking opportunistically at a better armed foe. David's rise, culminating in the famous clash with Goliath, is narrated in that same military frame. David's victory becomes more than one boy's triumph. It is a turning point in a long struggle between highland polities seeking to transform the balance of arms and status in the region. Yet even David's conquests did not erase Philistia overnight. Military defeat can break a city's power without erasing its people, its customs, or its economic functions. The Philistines' resilience was partly institutional. Their confederation of 5 cities allowed for decentralized survival. One city might be sacked while the others endured and adapted. This political arrangement complicated the complete annihilation of a people, but imperial forces did not always spare cities for the sake of regional balance. The Assyrian Empire, rising to dominance in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, pursued punitive campaigns that reshuffled populations and removed elites. Assyrian inscriptions and administrative practices demonstrate a systematic approach to control that often included deportations, installation of client rulers, and resettlement to weaken rebellious provincial centers. For Philistia, this meant erosion of autonomy. Some cities became vassals paying tribute to Assyrian kings, others were directly targeted in military operations. The cumulative effect was to undercut the political coherence of the Philistine Confederacy. The Babylonian onslaught in the early 6th century BC, led by Nebuchadnezzar II, further accelerated these processes. Babylonian campaigns against the Levant did not single out Philistia alone, but coastal cities suffered wave after wave of imperial pressure, sieges, sackings, and population displacement that would have obliterated civic infrastructure and destabilized the institutions that maintained cultural distinctiveness. The prophetic texts, Jeremiah's oracle against the Philistines, Jeremiah 47, Ezekiel's pronouncements against the coastal cities, Ezekiel 25:26, and Zephaniah's naming of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, Zephaniah 2:4-7, speak in theological terms about desolation and scattering. Historically, those images align with the very real processes of destruction and deportation that empires applied to the Levantine littoral. Yet historical processes are rarely total in the literal sense. Cities were razed and then reoccupied. Elites were deported and replaced. Cultic centers were dismantled and sometimes reconstituted. Where the prophetic rhetoric speaks of annihilation, archaeology tends to reveal layers of destruction, followed by phases of reuse, hybridization, and replacement. This is a crucial point for interpreting the prophecy. The language of ruin and desolation is expressive and theological, but it can correspond to the socio-political mechanisms that dissolve a distinct civic identity over time. Imperial conquest can break the structures that sustain an ethnic or cultural boundary, leadership, ritual centers, urban economies, and once those structures collapse, assimilation and intermarriage with neighboring groups often follow. As the first millennium BC unfolded, Philistia's urban landscape changed. Some centers decline, others continue under new political arrangements, and the local elites who remain increasingly participate in the linguistic and administrative norms of the surrounding world. Ekron's Neo-Assyrian and later inscriptions show rulers bearing Semitic names and administering a city that is integrated into imperial networks. The Ekron inscription discovered in the late 20th century is particularly revealing because it places Ekron's royal house within a historical framework that interacts with Assyrian and Judean politics. Epigraphy helps us see the Philistine political class not as a static foreign enclave, but as actors negotiating power within larger imperial systems. The Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BC establishes a different administrative order. Cyrus's decree in 539 BC reshaped the Near East. Many displaced peoples returned to their homelands, and imperial control relied on satrapal governance, taxation, and local client elites. Philistine cities were no longer independent coastal tyrannies. They became components in a vast imperial economy. Over the centuries, long-term exposure to new administrative languages, trade links, and population movements, Greek mercenaries, Phoenician merchants, and others, rewired the cultural map. Alexander's campaign in 332 BC brought Hellenization to the Levant, and Greek language and institutions spread. Under Hellenistic and then Roman sovereignty, the distinctive markers that once identified Philistine identity, Aegean-style pottery, separate burial customs, a separate lingua franca, faded further into the broader currents of Mediterranean life. It is in this slow unthreading that the answer to "where are they now?" begins to take shape. The Philistines did not leave a clean archaeological blank. They left traces that archaeologists and texts can read. But the combination of military defeat, deportation policies, elite replacement, intermarriage, economic integration, and changing religious landscapes produced assimilation. The result: by the Persian and Hellenistic periods, there is no clear, self-conscious Philistine polity maintaining an unbroken ethnic boundary. Biological ancestry may have persisted, fragments of Aegean-related ancestry long into later centuries, but ethnic identity is more than DNA. It is institutions, language, ritual, and communal memory. Those were gradually absorbed or overwritten. In short, the people known to the biblical oracles as the Philistines ceased to exist as a cohesive, independent ethnic group. They were assimilated into the successive populations that ruled and reshaped the region. This trajectory is precisely what recent genetic work helps illuminate. The excavation of Ashkelon's cemetery and subsequent aDNA analysis provided a unique window into ancestry at the individual level. Early Iron Age individuals unearthed at Ashkelon exhibited genetic components that cluster with Aegean-related populations, which then diminish in later Iron Age samples as local Levantine ancestry increases. In plainer terms, the genetic record shows newcomers with partial Aegean ancestry arriving and then quickly mixing with local peoples. But it is essential to underscore the limits of these data. The number of sampled individuals remains modest, dozens, not thousands, and the geographic coverage is limited to certain sites. Ancient DNA offers snapshots, not sweeping demographic totals. Still, when combined with pottery styles, burial customs, and textual testimony, the aDNA evidence strengthens the model of a maritime origin group that blends into the local gene pool over a few centuries. Archaeological discoveries beyond Ashkelon add corroborating color. Excavations at Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza have recovered urban layouts, fortifications, and material culture that suggest an initially foreign imprint gradually marked by Levantine acculturation. The Ekron inscription demonstrates administrative continuity and interaction with wider Near Eastern polities. The Ashkelon cemetery, with its distinct burial assemblages and imported material, illuminates funerary customs and social distinctions in early phases. Pottery, those elegant bichrome vessels with Aegean motifs, decorates domestic contexts and tells of craft traditions carried across the sea. Yet all these artifacts also show change. After generations, local motifs and techniques blend with earlier styles, creating hybrid material cultures. Religion deserves special attention because it most directly informs the what did they believe. Half of our question, the short answer is syncretic, martial, maritime-focused cults with Aegean and Levantine elements. Dagon is the best-known Philistine deity, and the Hebrew Bible repeatedly links Dagon to Philistine worship. most famously when the Ark of the Covenant is placed in Dagon's temple at Ashdod, 1 Samuel 5. While the Bible casts these cults in polemical terms, archaeology and comparative religion suggest a more textured picture. The Philistine cultic repertoire likely included sea-associated rites, feasting rituals, votive offerings, and ceremonies that reinforced urban leadership and military ethos. Their religious architecture and material remains contain Aegean artistic influences, such as bird and fish imagery and certain animal motifs, alongside Levantine elements like Baal-like storm god features. That fusion is not surprising. A people formed through migration and then immersed in Canaanite religious environments would naturally produce syncretic practices. We should be careful, though, about detailing beliefs that remain only partially visible. Temple plans, figurines, offering tables, and dedicatory inscriptions point to public cults with prominent male deities, but they do not yield a complete theological system. Nor do we have a Philistine Bible. Liturgy and myth are largely lost. What survives are glimpses, names of gods, archaeological contexts that suggest communal feasting and sacrifice, and the biblical polemics that remember Philistine worship as foreign and threatening. Taken together, the evidence points to a people who anchored their identity in maritime prosperity, martial values, and a pantheon suited to those priorities. Gods who promised success at sea and in war, and rituals that bound elites and citizens to the city's fortunes. It is instructive to align these religious features with the prophetic oracles. When prophets declared the destruction of Philistine altars, the toppling of their gods, and the desolation of their cities, they were speaking in terms intelligible to their audience, the eradication of a civic religious order that sustained political independence. If the temple of Dagon in Ashdod was pillaged, or if sacrifices ceased because the elite priestly class had been deported or impoverished, the cult would lose its social function. Prophetic language of desolation and broken altars thus corresponds to the historical mechanisms, conquest, deportation, loss of elite support, that can dismantle an embedded religious system. The prophets' theological pronouncements capture the moral and spiritual meaning of political events. History provides the mechanisms by which those proclamations could be realized. Another element complicates the story: continuity of place names. Even as the Philistines fade, the memory of their presence persists in toponymy. The names of their cities continue in the landscape for centuries, and later geographic labels, most notably the Roman-era usage of Palestina, derive linguistically from older terms associated with Philistia. Here lies one of history's ironies. The people who once gave names to coastal sites disappear as a distinct group, but the name itself endures in maps, texts, and later empires. That survival of a name without the continuity of a distinct people underlines the difference between cultural memory and unbroken ethnic identity. It also cautions us against simplistic readings that equate ancient labels with modern political realities. Place names migrate and are reused in new contexts. As we draw toward a synthesis, it is worth restating the careful posture required by both faith and scholarship. The prophetic corpus asserts that Philistia would suffer judgment. History and archaeology provide a nuanced account of how that suffering unfolded. Conquest, deportation, and imperial integration eroded the structures that maintained Philistine distinctiveness. Migration and intermarriage, along with economic and linguistic assimilation, dissolved the social boundaries that make an ethnic group recognizable across centuries. Genetic studies add a biological dimension to this narrative. An initially detectable Aegean-related ancestry that becomes diluted through mixing. None of these strands alone proves every aspect beyond doubt. Together, however, they form a convergent case, The Philistines arrived as a distinct Mediterranean-derived coalition, built resilient urban centers with unique cultural markers, clashed with their neighbors for centuries, and were ultimately absorbed into the larger currents of Near Eastern history. So to answer the title directly, where are they now? The Philistines are not a living, distinct ethnic group in the modern world. Their people were assimilated into successive populations during the first millennium BC and beyond, losing distinct institutions, language, and communal identity. Their biological ancestry likely persisted in mixed form within the populations of the Levant, but as a coherent Philistine nationality or ethnicity, they ceased to exist. And what did they believe? Their religion was a syncretic blend, rooted in Aegean and Levantine traditions. Gods like Dagon figure prominently in the evidence, centered on maritime prosperity, martial success, and communal cultic life that reinforced urban elites. Their theological framework, insofar as we can reconstruct it, fused elements from their Mediterranean origins with the local Canaanite environment, producing cultic practices and iconography suited to a people who lived by the sea and fought for cities. This conclusion should be read with two cautions in mind. First, prophecy is a theological genre that shapes how events are narrated and interpreted. It is not a forensic report. The prophetic language can and should be read both as spiritual assertion and as commentary on historical realities. Second, scientific claims, especially those arising from ancient DNA, require steady scrutiny. The number of samples, their geographic limitations, and the complexities of population genetics mean that aDNA is a powerful tool, but not an omniscient oracle. Responsible historical synthesis weighs textual testimony, material culture, and genetic data together, acknowledging uncertainties while appreciating where the evidence converges. There is a theological texture to this history worthy of reflection. The prophetic oracles against Philistia were couched in moral judgment, portraying foreign enemies as instruments of historical testing or objects of divine censure. For readers within the faith tradition, the convergence of prophecy and historical outcome can evoke a sense of providential ordering. For historians, it is an occasion to examine how theological language interacts with political realities. Both readings can coexist, provided we respect the methodological limits of each discipline. Theology speaks to meaning and purpose. Archaeology and genetics speak to mechanisms and processes. Finally, the Philistine story invites us into a posture of humility before the past. Nations and cultures rise with an energy that feels permanent to their people, yet centuries later they may vanish as distinct collectives. What remains, pottery shards, a ruined wall, a broken altar, a name on a map, can be precious testimony to lives once vibrant. For students of scripture and history alike, this is not merely an antiquarian curiosity. It is a mirror. The rise and fall of Philistia remind us that human institutions are fragile, that cultural identity is mutable, and that the judgments recorded in sacred texts intersect with historical forces in ways that invite both reverence and careful inquiry. If you'd like to go deeper into the archaeological and genetic studies we mentioned, examination of the Ashkelon cemetery data, the Ekron inscription, and the latest aDNA analyses, check the description below for sources and a suggested reading list. And if this exploration stirred questions for you, consider watching our next video, Archaeology versus Bible, How Reliable Are the Sources?, where we unpack the methods historians use to weigh texts against material evidence. Until then, let the story of the Philistines sharpen your sense of how history, faith, and science can come together to illuminate the past, and how a name carved on an ancient map can outlast the speaker who once uttered it.